O'Keefe. 7 to Susan O'Keefe.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Rabbitte, in your opening statement you were bound to say you did not make the connection between our alarm at what was happening in the housing market and the risk to the banking system. I must admit it never occurred to me that our banks might fail. Why do you think it never occurred I think you mean you, meaning all of you, or do you mean you yourself?
No, I'm only speaking for myself.
Okay. Yeah. And given that Northern Rock had the difficulties and various other, the American banks were beginning to really struggle, and Bear Stearns and so on, was it, what gave rise to you not making the connection, do you think?
The statement doesn't relate to what happened during the course of 2008. I'm talking about the property bubble as it emerged and when it emerged and as it growed like Topsy. And I'm saying that, no, frankly, I regret, make the connection between the property bubble and the risk to the banking system. I suppose partly because we were getting all these bouquets about the quality of our banks. Anglo-Irish won a competition somewhere, and Davos is the best bank in the world, I think. Bank of Ireland, private, similarly, had some award from memory. And we were being assured by the authorities, whose task it was to regulate the banks and make decisions about credit expansion and so on, that we had a very sound and robust banking system, and I bought it.
Tánaiste, we've heard in evidence that since November 2007, we've heard all about scoping documents and crisis simulation exercises and contingency and secret teams and documents briefing Department of Finance, Department of Taoiseach, all kinds of documents talking about problems with liquidity, talking about the bank's share prices falling, talking about the decreasing situation in relation to the economy. Were any of those documents, was any of that information made available to you in your capacity as spokesperson, or indeed perhaps to Mr. Rabbitte as leader? Or had you, yeah, or indeed to Mr. Gilmore's leader as it? So, would either of you ever had access to those kind of documents?
No, Senator, they weren't made available. In fact, any reference I've seen to those indicate that they were carried out in considerable secrecy, because there was also a desire at the time, and in fact people often talked, particularly people from the government parties, talked about people wearing green jerseys. There was also, as there is now, but more so then, a great deal of inhibition in terms of Oireachtas rules of specific institutions being named. There was one initiative which was undertaken by the Finance Committee, partly at my suggestion. The Finance Committee in those days made a visit to the United States every 2 years or so, and it was due to be in the autumn of 2008. And I suggested to the Chair and to the members that with what was evolving, that perhaps we should try and go to the United States and see could we get some level of briefing and so on. And we did that, if I recall, in the week after Easter of 2008. And I have to say, I came back from that visit full of a certain amount of foreboding. But I want to reiterate again, my fears were very concentrated around the way Anglo-Irish had developed and Irish Nationwide as a small building society. There was an awful lot more information and commentary, and Deputy Rabbitte has referenced one significant piece of commentary, the Morgan Kelly articles in the Irish Times, which were suggesting increasingly that the Irish situation was fragile and at risk. But as against that, I mean, the Department of Finance was very remote from mere opposition deputies. It was entirely, if you like, related to, in my experience, to the government and the government parties.
Can I interrupt, Taoiseach, because in fact, when Mr. Cowan was giving evidence here, he said, this is on page 92, when he left, and he meant when he left his job as Minister for Finance to move on to being the Taoiseach, he said there wasn't a crisis at that point. That would have been late April, early May.
I have to say I was very, very concerned. There was a lot of, if you like, commentary of a brief kind in the media. There was a lot of conversations. Journalists were asking questions. I was also using my position as an opposition spokesperson to, as I said, talk about, for instance, reining in the tax-driven speculation in land, because people often talk about the huge rise in construction prices, but Deputy Rabbitte referred to it earlier. The real rise in costs was actually in land costs. Construction prices did rise, but it was the land values that rose, so that, say, someone on a modest income who might have bought a house for 250 or 300,000, that kind of house was becoming priced at 450 to 500,000, and it was going out of the reach even of people who had employment in the public service. It was all of those kind of happenings that were very concerning to anybody who was following what was happening in finance.
Can I say finally, when the Financial Stability Report of 2007 was being discussed at the Finance Committee in January 2008, you said the economic clouds are gathering, but Ireland can ride out this storm if the government takes action without delay. What were you thinking that action should or could be, given that we didn't see, if you like, any action until the 30th of September, in a way, and that was an emergency or a crisis-driven action? What were you suggesting, do you think, there?
My biggest concern at that time was in relation to Anglo-Irish Bank, because I can't just stress, this was a small specialist bank for developers who are a certain percentage of the activity in a country. There were other customers of the bank.
Well, others have given evidence that in fact it was a systemic bank.
Historically, it had become, in the stats, bigger than either the Bank of Ireland or the Allied Irish Bank.
We've had that testimony already from you, Senator.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, others have said that actually Anglo became, it may not have been on the face of it a monoline or a developer's bank, but it became systemic, and therefore that was the reason. But I was asking you specifically, what were you thinking the government ought to do when you said it should take action without delay? That was January 2008. Long before action was taken.
And I had said that as well in the previous September when the Northern Rock crisis broke in the United Kingdom.
What did you want the government to do?
I wanted the government to have a much stronger system of regulation and oversight, and I wanted the tax breaks and so on that I referred to, which I believed were driving the bubble in credit and lending to the commercial sector. I wanted that addressed, and I felt that if they were taken down, well, then there was a better possibility of what was described as the soft landing. Also, from 2007...
The question is made. I mean, finally, I wanted to ask whether or not, in those final months, whether any bankers, developers, individuals came to ask either you, Mr. Gilmore, Mr. Rabbitte, for help, for advice, whether you could lobby or intercede on their part, because we've heard of lots of meetings going on, or not.
The only person who really asked for my advice was Brian Lenihan, the late Brian Lenihan, who was a constituency colleague of mine.
Just before you talk about him, though, I'm asking about developers or bankers, particularly, outside.
No,
they never came
because
to talk to you.
They basically had an approach that anyone who was in any way critical of what was happening, even in broad general terms, there was this language around the green jersey and supporting the narrative. And also, I have to say on my own part, I was extremely cautious about any statements which in any way would cause more damage. So I think on the part of almost everybody in the Oireachtas at the time, there was a great deal of concern and caution. But that was interleaved with the various witnesses who came into the committees, and like Mr. Neary, the chief executive of the regulator, who repeatedly said the fundamentals are sound, the banks are well capitalised.
So why, final question, why would Mr. Lenihan, in that case, given what you've said about the Green Jersey agenda, why would Mr. Lenihan, above all people, if you like, as the Minister for Finance in the government, ask for your advice?
I think Mr. Lenihan spoke to many members of the Dáil and Seanad on a frequent basis. We were also constituency colleagues, and we attended quite a number of functions where in fact we spent time together.
What did you say to him when he asked?
I said he needed to get very good advice and expertise, and I advised him strongly to look for expert advice in relation to the difficulties that seemed to be, if you like, it was a period of considerable financial uncertainty, and more information was coming out in relation to specific problems in Ireland. And I felt that if he had more expert advice, he might in fact be able to respond more rapidly. I was very disappointed when that government went off in June or July of 2008 and then did not come back until September, when obviously the crisis literally exploded.
Senator McMahon.
Thank you.
May I just say, Chairman, I think the question was addressed to me as well. May I just say that I get the impression that the inquiry, as a result of hearing testimony to the fact that there were some big players in the financial sector advocating a guarantee, and there were some senior officials considering the options and so on, I think it's important to say that the political system didn't know this at the time. We didn't go to bed on the night of the 28th of September knowing that the world would have changed on the 29th of September. We didn't know. I mean, this information in terms of did bankers approach us, did developers approach us, this information was being kept under wraps prior to the 28th of September. And after the 28th of September, the bankers felt they had got an insurance policy that insulated them. And in terms of the question about making the connection between the property bubble and the risk to the financial system, I think the record of the House will show for that night that two deputies, Deputy Michael Noonan and myself, raised the question of solvency. And as Deputy Burton has said, there was a great deal of caution around. Banks weren't named by name and all the rest. But we put in separate interventions whether we were dealing purely with a liquidity crisis. Now, the Minister for Finance of the day, the late Brian Lenihan, did not answer. I wouldn't have expected him to answer. I don't think the Minister for Finance could stand up and say, yes, I'm afraid, Deputy, it's wider than liquidity. There is a solvency issue. I don't think the Minister for Finance could say that. But that's the first time, and the record of the House will show it, that question was raised.
Okay, thank you. Senator McMahon.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and welcome, Taoiseach Deputy. Taoiseach, I have no questions for you until the end, so I just have two very brief ones at the end for you, so they'll all be for Deputy Rabbitte. Deputy, you have a reputation for calling it like it is, if I might say, and can I ask you to identify...
Well, I certainly got the Connacht final right anyway, Deputy.
Indeed. Indeed. You might have underestimated it, maybe. So as somebody who calls it like it is, could you say to me and just identify which pre-budget or post-budget, pre-budget proposals the Labour Party proposed gross reductions in expenditure and net increases in taxation, or were there any?
Well, I think the substance of the budget is reflected in the finance bill. and it is in the amendments travelled to the finance bill that is the evidence of that. And our main evidence in that regard would be attempting to take on the incentives and the reliefs that were there.
Okay. Is the short answer none?
Oh no, it's not. It's not at all. There is a book of amendments travelled in those years to the finance.
I just want to be specific. The time is very short, and we don't want to do the tarnished on it.
But I'm being
Can
specific.
you tell us, was there ever a pre-budget proposal from the Labour Party, which all lumped in together, so all the voted and non-voted expenditure and capital, which were, sorry, I was, Taoiseach, if I wanted to ask you, I'd have asked you. I'm asking Deputy Rabbitte, who was the leader at the time. Can you say, was there any set of proposals, when added together, which said, we are looking for gross reductions in expenditure and net increases in taxation? Yes or no?
Yes. We fought a number of the spending decisions of that time. For example, I was very prominent myself, almost alone in the Dáil in terms of the Bertie Bowl.
Yeah. So that's one issue now. Chairman, you know where I'm coming from on this.
I'll afford you a bit of time.
It's the overall thing, you know, so, as opposed to the individual calamities. Sorry, apart from the Bertie Bowl, could you tell me, was it budget 05, 04, 03, 06, where the Labour Party were proposing X net reduction in expenditure and Y net increases in taxation?
Well, an enormous...
What year was that?
I don't remember the years.
So is there a year
Senator,
that was the case?
There were several years successively.
Yeah, which ones?
And a very... from about 2001 in particular.
From about 2001, I mean, which specific ones? Because the only ones, having done an analysis of it that I can see, are ones that look for increases in expenditure and decreases in taxation. From a gross and net perspective.
I need to allow some time for Deputy Rabbitte to respond, please.
From about 2001 to 2007, we would have argued for constraints in terms of the monies lost to the Exchequer in respect of the various tax incentives and tax shelters and tax reliefs that were there. We would have opposed some of the vanity projects like e-voting and the Bertie Bowl and PPARs and those. And we were careful in terms of the budget proposals that we advanced that they were costed by the Department of Finance and that they were in sync. And earlier questions about us providing for twice the growth rate in spending is of course not true. I mean, the figures were compiled on the
So I didn't ask that question now. That's somebody else's question from earlier.
I'll afford a bit of time.
5 minutes left. I still have 4 questions.
No, I'll afford you plenty of time.
It's very relevant to this question. The 5-year construction of our plan was based on 4.5% growth per annum, which from memory would have produced additional revenues to the Exchequer of in excess of 11 billion. So if you take the growth rate, provide for inflation, take the add-on of 2%, it would be at least half that again. So they were the revenues that we thought, based on the expert advice from agencies like the SRI and the Department of Finance, that were available to us. There's always a reason to spend money. I think we would have tried to spend it more wisely than what actually happened.
Yeah, I need to move on.
In some cases.
Yeah. I'm going to move on because I've asked it 3 times and I'm still not getting the answer. Okay?
But you did get the answer.
No, I didn't.
You mightn't have got the answer you wanted, but
I didn't get the answer.
Don't confuse that with not getting the answer.
I'm not confusing the answer at all.
Okay.
I'm not confusing the answer at all. I mean,
Senator?
Do you feel you had commented in a more modern era, but about the practice? So I'm going to put the question about in pre-election periods that in terms of promising, you said on prime time, well, that's what one tends to do, I think was the precise quote. Can I ask, in your preparation for the 2007 general election, did the Labour Party cow down to the lower tax, high expenditure policies of Fine Gael in order to win that general election, or were you happy to go with low taxation, high expenditure, all by your own?
Well, firstly, Deputy, that's a misrepresentation of what I said and what some of my colleagues take great pleasure in misrepresenting. That was an exchange with...
I suppose the important type of the question is, did the Labour Party count
The question
down?
has two parts to it, and two parts to be answered.
You've put it on the record here now.
Yeah.
Please permit me to answer it. That was an exchange with Sean O'Rourke about a particular advertisement. I was seeking to explain the issue of child benefit and why we pledged to hold it at what it was and why, in the circumstances, we had to make a modest cut in it. And he said, you didn't explain any of that at the time, you just kept it simple. And I said, yes, isn't that what you tend to do at election time? Especially if it's an ad, you have to keep it simple. So that's the first bit.
So the main part of the question then?
I've loads of time to you, Senator. I won't cut your time short.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Senator, Deputy Rabbitte.
No, it was not our approach to go for the cut taxes and cut public spending. I mean, the revenues, on the basis of the expert advice available to us, suggested that we would have a cake that was large enough to do certain things that we wanted to do. And we didn't resile in any way in the discussions with Fine Gael in respect of the things that we wanted to do, for example, in relation to pensions and property and other reliefs that were available. We didn't resile from any of that.
Yeah, can I ask, do you think it's credible for you to say to the people of Ireland that the previous government overspent and undertaxed when the sum of the Fine Gael and Labour manifestos, if implemented, would have made the landing even harder than it was?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that that's the case. And secondly, you're putting words in my mouth that I never said.
Well, let me ask you a question. Let me ask the question.
Yeah, but I'm telling you that the premise of your question is wrong.
No, but
what I have said...
It's not about the premise. It's about answering the question. You know, we're not having a political debate. I'm asking a question. You answer it.
Please.
It's not about your judgmental attitude towards the premise of my question.
Sorry,
is it correct or is it not to
Senator,
say that if your policies were implemented, that you would have led to a harder landing in the economy?
I just need to make an intervention here. The member is entitled to ask the question and can structure it up in the legal framework of this inquiry and would deliver it as such. The witness before the inquiry can shape the question as to how they wish to respond within the terms of reference of the inquiry as well. Deputy Rabbitte.
Thanks, Chairman. What I said, Chairman, in my opening remarks, what I said is that, in my view, the main cause of the disaster that befell our country was the out-of-control property bubble, spurred on by tax incentives and expansionary lending. That was the cause of it, and that was the specific thing I put in my statement. Senator McSharry is putting a different point to me, and I'm explaining to him why I don't agree with his characterisation of what I said.
Senator McSharry.
Yeah, you didn't answer the question. You made a statement. So I'm going to move on because time is short.
The question's answered. I can't have people comment things.
An answer was given
evidence
to the question.
Given here. A commentary.
Can I ask? I still have three questions. So I need to get on with.
I'm going to give you as much time as you like.
Thanks, William.
But it is not just standard practice, but it is a requirement of this inquiry that evidence given before it over its entire duration is not to be commented upon publicly by members of this inquiry, either in media engagements they may have later today or at other times, or even in real time. I just explained this to all members now. The judgment upon evidence provided to this inquiry will be dealt with when we move on to the committee, onto the report design stage of this. I'm just saying that. So commentary upon anybody's evidence today, publicly out loud, is actually difficult because it could be a breach of the terms of reference.
And what's that got to do with what I'm doing now?
Well, the issue, I'm just putting it out there as a warning with regard to
who?
Response to
for everybody.
Yes, for any answer.
Could you kick the warning until I'm finished and asking me a question?
No,
it's not to do with what I'm doing. Do you share Enda Kenny's criticisms of benchmarking?
No. I would be more nuanced in my reaction to it. If it were an appropriate benchmarking, I think it had a role to play at the time. But unfortunately, it became, as so many things during that time, as a vehicle to dish out substantial amounts of money without discernment or discrimination. But the notion of benchmarking in the public service or in the public sector is not a bad one at all. It's the methodology and its implementation and all the rest that matters.
Finally, two questions, and I'll put them both at once, and they're, the first one is to both of you, and the last one is just for the Taoiseach. Were either of you any of the beneficiaries of hospitality from developers, including, as per questioning earlier, transportation or lifts or flights or helicopters or anything like that? And if it emerged that other opposition leaders, for example, would that concern you? That's the first question. So, have you been beneficiary, and would it concern you if others were? The second question then is, Taoiseach, had you a hand in altering the configuration of this committee? Did you support it? And why was it so important for the government to have a majority on this inquiry? Thank you.
Please.
The hospitality issue is an issue of transport, is it? I mean, if I got a pint at some stage from a developer, is that included in the rubric of your question?
Well, you must judge these things. I can only ask the question, were you a recipient of hospitality from the developers in all its known guises, including transportation, because we specifically honed in on that with other witnesses? And it's for a matter for your judgment as to how you answer that. I'm not going to put words in your mouth.
Not that I recall, Senator. I recall travelling to view a business park in Bristol when I was chairman of the County Council, or when I was a member of Dublin County Council, when we were designing what has now become City West Business Park, probably the most prestigious park in the country. And I presume it wasn't Dublin County Council who paid for us to travel. I presume it were the developers who brought over 6 or 8 or 10 of us to view the park that we replicated at City West. But I would regard that as part of my job and part of my duty rather than hospitality. Yeah, I've travelled to matches. One friend of mine in particular is a small builder. Or maybe more appropriately, to be truthful, I don't know how good he is at it, his father was the small builder. And I notice sometimes, Senator, that talent skips a generation.
That's good, actually. That's good. So your opinion then of anybody else who might have been recipients of hospitality?
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Are you going to tell me? Are you going to tell me?
Am I going to tell you?
Your opinion of the leader of Fianna Fáil, or the leader of Fine Gael, or the leader of Sinn Féin, or whoever?
Well, I don't think I'm here to pass judgment on my colleagues in other parties. I mean, I don't know.
You think it would be appropriate?
I don't think it would be appropriate for me to do that, and I don't intend to comment on.
Legal advice I have in my ear is telling me that the deputy has answered the question as best as he can.
Oh, yeah, okay. Now, Taoiseach, over to yourself. Do you think talent speaks to generation as well, by the way, just so we can have that on the record?
Well, didn't somebody say a long-legged thing called a son?
Oh, yes.
You know.
So now, we've all got it out of our systems. Can we get down to the answering of the questions?
Sorry, Deputy, or Chairperson, could I ask the Deputy to repeat which part of which question he's asking me to answer? I've got a bit lost.
Okay, all right.
Deputy.
Have you, first of all, been the recipient of any hospitality in all its guises, including transportation to and from matches with good or bad builders, or where talent skips a generation or not, as Deputy Rabbitte so eloquently put it?
No.
Never.
No, not to my knowledge.
And to the best of, I got the answer, yeah. So to the best of your knowledge then, can you tell us if other party leaders were involved in this kind of thing, what is your view of that? Would that concern you? Do you think it's appropriate? If it was a coalition partner, for example, would that concern you at all?
Speculating on something here now that you have.
I'm speculating on nothing.
No, I'd say the witness.
I'm speculating on nothing.
No, I said the witness may be speculating.
No, I've asked for a view.
Yeah, okay.
If this were the case, what's the situation?
Well, I came here in the context of a banking inquiry, and it might be helpful to me, Deputy, if you could just explain how I can assist you in the context of the banking inquiry.
As I said to previous witnesses, we've been consistent for over a year now in asking the full range of questions of all people, regardless of background, whether they're in politics, banking, anything else, and you're no exception. So we're asking you the same questions. So can I ask you if you think it's appropriate if a political colleague, party leader, coalition partner, or anybody else was a recipient of corporate hospitality in all its guises, including transportation, from a developer, do you think that's appropriate?
Well, I'm not in a position, Deputy, to be aware of what you may be implying.
I'm not implying anything. I'm not implying anything now.
Without interruption.
Chairman,
well,
you have to direct the witness here.
If you have a specific example
I don't.
that I might be aware of.
I don't.
But I'm not aware
I don't, but it's in the context.
I'm not
the witness has answered the question.
No, she hasn't answered.
Yeah, I'll answer the question.
In fairness, a lot of these things are to do with Galway tents and all that stuff that's very important to this inquiry and ought to be brought up and discussed. So you're no exception. Everybody's been asked about it. So I'm asking you.
But the witness can only account.
What is your view of this?
The witness can only account for themselves.
In public, on many occasions, I disapproved of the Galway tent, and I advocated strongly for the reform of disclosure requirements by people involved in politics at all levels in relation to contributions, donations of any kind, and in that so did
transportation.
The Labour Party
Would that be included?
Party.
Would transportation to be included in that, would it?
Well, we now have a reform system where receipts of benefits in kind.
Yeah, no, but in the period up to 2007, it was different, I think.
I've really accommodated
no,
this.
It's the very last one, because I did ask it.
And
she wants to know. She asked me to explain the two questions. The other one is: did you have a hand in altering the makeup of this inquiry? Did you agree with the altering of it? Why, if you did? And why was it so important for the government to have a majority on this inquiry?
Reference that is outside the terms of reference to this.
No, I asked it of the Taoiseach.
I
asked it of the Taoiseach, and it was allowed and answered. So I think it's only fair to his coalition partner that she be afforded the same opportunity.
I wasn't the leader of the Labour Party at the time when the committee was being established, Deputy, as you possibly are aware.
So I'm asking your political opinion.
So I therefore wasn't involved in discussion in relation to the makeup of the committee. So I'm just very pleased that all of the parties are represented.
Yeah. Can I ask for your view, please?
Are working so hard.
Do you think that was appropriate?
Up so hard.
Do you think it was appropriate?
Do you
think that was appropriate?
The witness is.
It's yes or no. I mean, is it appropriate?
Please.
Is it appropriate?
Yeah. We've treated no other witnesses like this.
Have we not?
We have not.
We haven't had
lack of discipline in questioning wartime.
Do you think that's appropriate? Yes or no? I mean, yes or no?
Can I please make an intervention, please?
Was it appropriate to alter
if the witness, Senator McSherry, please.
She doesn't want to answer.
Senator McSherry, please, because I don't want to be in a situation where somebody.
I mean, I don't know. I mean,
Senator
make it up as we go along.
Please, the witness, if they feel satisfied that they have answered the question is answered because it's very much outside the terms of reference. Are you satisfied you answered the question? Taoiseach. Yes.
My answer is that I wasn't involved in any discussions in relation to this committee. I wasn't the leader of the Labour Party at that time. You'd have to ask my predecessor about that.
As you know, the question was in three parts. The first one was, were you involved? She says no to that. The second one is, do you support it? Yeah. And the third one was, why do you think the government felt it necessary to have a majority on this inquiry? It's a very reasonable question.
Are you satisfied?
You're the second most powerful political person in the country.
I'm
sure I could answer.
Do you want to add any more?
If you wanted to.
Do you want to add any more to Taoiseach?
No, I've given my answers.
Oh, all right, thank you. Deputy Owen Murphy.
Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses. I want to address, if I may, the role of opposition and the ability, more actually, the ability of opposition to hold the government to account when it comes to big decisions like the guarantee. So, Tánaiste, when the guarantee was put on the table and put before the Dáil, did you consult with Richard Bruton as to whether or not the Labour Party or Labour and Fine Gael would support the guarantee decision?
There were not inter-party discussions, Deputy, about the decisions to be made by the different parties, for the reason that the guarantee happened overnight and during the night, and I think people woke up to hear it being announced on RTE on the morning, and there was considerable astonishment, shock, dismay. I think all of the parties, and certainly in the Labour Party, we were invited to meet representatives of the Department of Finance who were going to brief us, and that happened at intervals immediately after the guarantee on the day and in several days afterwards. I have to say, Deputy, that in the briefings that I received, I asked a couple of questions in relation to two institutions, Anglo-Irish.
Beg your pardon, it's just that question about whether or not you consulted with Richard Bruton in those following days as opposition, the opposition might
not
take.
formally, but there were very long periods in the House when there were conversations between deputies from all sides of the House, because people were obviously extremely worried and exercised by what had befallen the country. Now, at that time, in terms of Fianna Fáil and in terms of the government's presentation, it was to be the cheapest bank guarantee in the world.
Again, I'm just trying to look at the mechanics of opposition and how the opposition might hold the government to account. So, Deputy Rabbitte, if I may, did you ever attempt to approach Enda Kenny and Fine Gael to see if the opposition would take a united position on whether or not to support or vote against the guarantee decision?
Well, again, I think the actual context in which this happened is important. I happened purely by accident to meet my colleague Eamon Gilmore very early that morning, and my mouth was open at the news I had just heard, and I briefly discussed it with him. Somebody had already been on to him about dated subordinated debt, and he said that he had already decided that we should oppose it because he felt we were mortgaging the deeds of the country. And there was no time to discuss with anybody else. I mean, he got a phone call from Brian Linehan at whatever time that morning, and really everything happened very quickly.
But were you surprised then at the position that they took? And did you seek to change that?
Well, I mean, I could see the circumstances where if you get a phone call at 6:30 in the morning from the Minister for Finance, who has been struggling most of the night with an issue as big as this one, where the financial system was at risk, I could see that a party like Fine Gael, whose core existence would be supporting the institutions of the state, would say, well, if the financial system is at risk and you're telling me that, we'll take your word on it and let's see how the legislation evolves.
But did you know something that Fine Gael or the government didn't that enabled you to take the position that you took? You mentioned that Eamon Gilmore had already gotten phone calls about subordinated debt. So what did you know that the others didn't that allowed you to vote against the guarantee decision?
I wouldn't like to claim knowledge that we didn't have. This was just such an enormous insurance bet that we were wagering literally the deeds of the country on it never being called in. And that was a pretty scary place to be. Now, I had advocated personally the nationalisation of Anglo privately, and a date around this time, it's on the record of the House, an intervention I made to that effect. Following which, the late Brian Linehan came to me to say that I had a letter that morning published in the Irish Times concerning nationalisation of Anglo and concerning the fact that I read into what the Minister told the House that he too was in favour of nationalising Anglo. And he came to me to say that they had a 2-hour meeting in the department about replying to the letter, that they decided in the event not to do so, and that nationalising Anglo was not the way out that I might have thought it was.
But given the fears that you had about the future of the country, which, transpired to be, appropriate fears, why not try and get the senior opposition party in line with your thinking to try and oppose this, so that the Dáil could hold the government to account responsibly in that regard?
Well, I wasn't the leader of the party. I had stepped down a few months earlier as leader of the party. Somebody in those circumstances does not intrude. I mean, I never opened my mouth at a meeting of the parliamentary party for a year and a half. I was not going to intrude onto the territory of the new leadership.
Okay, well, if I might just take you back just in the final question to when you were leader, and you spoke about it earlier, about at the beginning of January 2007, prior to the election, talking about going out with some warning signs about the economy, and you said you weren't on to a winner. So did you deliberately decide not to campaign on fiscal prudence, fiscal responsibility, or to sound those warnings during the campaign in 2007?
I think I was influenced by a number of people who brought the weight of official reports to bear on my argument and said, look, these are the authorities that matter, and they say the system is robust. In the environment in which we function, political party making its own forecasts has, unfortunately, little credibility. You tend to fall back on the agencies, national and international, and they were all saying that the system was sound and the system was robust.
Well, how do you go from a position where in January 2007 you have these concerns, that you air them publicly, to a manifesto for the election which is not raising any warning bells about the banking sector or about financial regulation, and which on almost every page has a commitment to increase spending?
Well,
how do you make that transition?
I think the main thrust of what I was saying related to the property bubble and the construction sector. And we didn't, as I said to Senator McSharry, we didn't resile from our position on the measures that needed to be taken to rein in the property bubble. We didn't resile from that in any way.
But did you ever think that you weren't putting enough resources into the area of financial stability when you were leader of the Labour Party, or using the resources of the Oireachtas in that way to have a proper understanding of the stability issues? Final question.
I have to truthfully, I have to honestly say that no, I didn't think that way, Deputy. In hindsight, I probably should have. But it just didn't occur to me that in the context of almost 15 years of growth, an economy that wasn't shaken off course for very long by the dot-com bubble, that had bounced back, that had a huge deficit in infrastructure, and that was now able to access cheap money to build up that infrastructure, it didn't occur to me that it posed a risk to the financial system itself, and maybe it should.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Deputy Pearse Doherty.
Mr. Riven, Tanisha, I guess, Chakta, again, Costa. Mr. Rabbitte, can I start with yourself? From the opposition viewpoint, how open to scrutiny was the government decision-making process, in your view?
In this particular respect?
Yes. I'm not just talking about the guarantee. We know that the guarantee was one night, but in relation to issues around finances, the banking crisis.
Well, I don't think that the theatre of the Dáil chamber is particularly effective in terms of opposition holding government to account. If you take the leader's questions moment, which was introduced only laterally, the opposition take up the issue of the day. Whatever party is in opposition, they took up whatever is the issue du jour, is the issue that they run with an eye to the 6 o'clock news, and the government does its best to bat it back. I don't think that's very effective in terms of accountability. I think the evolution of the network of parliamentary committees offers an opportunity for the kind of minute accountability that you're referring to that is not provided for in the Dáil chamber. So I think the answer to your question is not very good.
Okay. And in your view, and in relation to, again, this period and the financial crisis, do you believe that the Oireachtas sufficiently aware of the stakeholders with whom government ministers consulted in the pre-legislative stage of legislation around this period, and how was that information made available, if it was?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, I would disagree with the chairman if his question to Deputy Burton implies that he believes there would have been close contact between the leadership of an opposition party and, say, the senior officials in the Department of Finance. That did not happen in my experience. Yes, I personally had interaction with senior officials in the Department of Finance after the crash. But, I mean, the system operates on the basis that the senior officials serve government, and they're very wary and overly secretive about the opposition. And I think as well that this democracy business is intended, it was never intended for the same people to be in government for 14 years. When you look at it, it's not just the same party, it's almost the same people. And I think that there is a danger in those circumstances that there are some senior civil servants, if they don't become leveraged onto the side of what seems to be the permanent political government, they at least are not as robust as they might be in advising government that they have qualms about the direction of policy.
Okay, it takes me on to the next question. In your opinion, were the opposition parties, including your own party, adequately consulted, in particular on issues which may have been deemed as national importance? And I'm not just referring to civil servants here or officials. I'm talking about government ministers also as well.
The only area that I think it operated on very carefully and in a structured way and in a careful way was with respect to Northern Ireland. There certainly was regular contact there. And on particular pieces of legislation, there would be that kind of contact. But in terms of, government, whatever government, tends to keep its cards very close to its chest. And it doesn't say in the House, there's a weak link here and let's hope that Pierce Doherty doesn't hear about it. There is a very clear...
Is that ever going to change? Like, given the fact, we know from this inquiry, we've had evidence that guarantee legislation was being discussed at a very early stage in the spring of that year. We know that the nationalisation of banks were being discussed. We know that the Minister Lenihan himself went to the Attorney General and circumvented Cabinet because he was concerned about leaks. If these issues in terms of issues of national importance can't be trusted by a Minister to Cabinet, how could they be trusted to the opposition, where more than likely would be on their way out to RTE to try and get the slot in Morning Ireland the next morning to brief the public? Will this ever change, or have you...
I'm not so sure that in terms of the particular issue that we're talking about, I wouldn't be that critical of the Minister of the day in terms of him not sharing the information that there were deep concerns in his department about the future of the banking system and that options were being examined and being prepared. I mean, if that information had come out, it would have precipitated the day and would have rushed us into a situation where, the situation could be worse. Now, I would be critical of the Minister of the day in that I'm not sure, what he was doing driving around South Dublin eating garlic late after midnight shortly before the collapse. I would have thought that ever since Northern Rock, there was time there to sit down and say what's going on in our own banks and what measures can we take. And I presume he was being told that everything is hunky-dory. And as far as I can see, there are some people, I don't think they were dishonest. I think there are some people at the top of the banks themselves who were behaving recklessly, but who didn't even know the depth of the crisis themselves. And I think to ask a member of Dáil Éireann whether he or she should have been able to divine what was going on, I don't think is the way the real world operates.
Okay, can I ask Ms Burton, you refer on your opening statement on page 17 to the 1974 Kenny report. Could you explain to the committee the reasons why the Rainbow Coalition did not implement the findings of the Kenny report?
The Kenny report was a proposal to cap the price of building land, and I was a member of Dublin County Council, where most of the development in the country was taking place. The Rainbow government took over, when Labour went into government in 1992, the economy was in a very, very difficult place, and there was not an agreement with either the Fianna Fáil or indeed subsequently with Fine Gael to introduce legislation in relation to, in effect, capping the value of development land. In coalition negotiations, there are some items that are subject of agreement between the parties.
So it was because you couldn't get agreement, but Labour pushed
well,
for it?
I wasn't a negotiator in that particular set of negotiations for either of those governments, but that was my general understanding. It was a Labour point of view which the Labour Party returned to and brought forward legislation in the House in 2003. Deputy Gilmore did that. So it was a widely held belief.
That's fine. No, that's clear. Mr Rabbitte, and finally on this here, you were a member of the DIRT Inquiry Committee, and one of the findings was the undue close relationship between the state apparatus in the form of the Department of Finance, the Central Bank and the Irish financial institutions. We have it from the DIRT report, it's on page 52, but a quote from it it says, "There was a particular close and inappropriate relationship between banking and the state and its agencies. The evidence suggests that the state and its agencies were perhaps too mindful of the concerns of the banks and too attentive to their pleas and lobbying." Now, I put that out there as a former member of the DIRT Inquiry, which did, to a lot of people's minds, a lot of good work. We're sitting here in another inquiry. The findings of the inquiry that you were at seems to be some of the things that we're investigating into just a number of years later. So in your opinion, did the establishment of the Financial Regulator's Office in 2003 address the concerns raised by the DIRT Inquiry in the recommendations? And if not, why do you think they were ignored?
Well, I think that particular conclusion related to the concern that was there at the time that the consumer dimension was virtually ignored by the central bank. That the central bank saw its job as the prudential supervision of the banking sector, and it was not concerned with consumer issues, and there were a number of conflagrations about consumers being done down and it not having been policed and them not having redress. So I think it was in that particular context. Did 2003 resolve that? I mean, a lot of messing went on with that right from the publication of the DIRT report until the bill was brought into the House. I think maybe 3-4 years might have elapsed. And a lot of messing went on in a row between the two parties in government. The PDs wanted a greenfield regulator. Fianna Fáil generally wanted to retain it with the central bank, and the compromise was a hybrid, which I think was unfortunate, because I have watched snatches of your extraordinary work on this committee when the opportunity has presented, and I don't have much else to do nowadays, so I get my kicks watching you guys and so on. And I think, you bring in one person responsible, you think, for regulation, and he passes the book to the central bank. You bring in the central bank, and he said, no, the legislation says that's the job of the regulator, and they sling the ball out the wing. I think the substantial conclusion that I would like to see this inquiry draw, if I may suggest, is that we have a classic case here of regulatory capture. I think we set up a regulator, and I think before you could say Jack Robinson, he was doing the biddings of the banks rather than the other way around. And I think that's the tragedy, that's the genesis of the tragedy that has befallen us.
Right, thank you, Deputy. Deputy Joe Higgins.
Yeah, sure. I'm gratified that we can see that as well as the insomniacs and alcoholics, we can now add a new cohort of viewers. Demoted ministers. Chair, Tánaiste, Deputy Burton, just very briefly, you both touched on the issue of Oireachtas oversight, but for evidential reasons I just want another detail. You don't need to repeat the points, but in your opinion, to what extent was the oversight during the bubble period limited, if it was, by lack of specialist knowledge among TDs and senators? That's presumably of banking and finance, etc.
Well, it was a situation where when on joining the Oireachtas, somebody had previous experience in that area, for instance, perhaps some college education in relation to economics and so on, or had other, say, work experience in relation to different fields. After that, to be honest, Deputy Higgins, certainly in 2002, although I was the spokesperson for the Labour Party on finance, the Labour Party had one economic advisor of a very high calibre, I have to say, who acted both in relation to economics but in relation to a whole lot of other issues.
So expertise was available, you're saying?
We had one person for the whole of the Labour Party. I didn't have any specific person assigned to me. I think it was about 2005, 2006 when members of the Dáil got a parliamentary assistant, and I actually sought qualified people who would help me in relation to the brief I had.
Let me ask you a broader question then, Tánaiste. When we take the prevailing ethos of the period 2000 up to 2007, when some would say the entire establishment, from the financial markets to the media to the establishment political parties, or the majority of the Oireachtas, they were saturated with an ethos that provided for maximisation of profit, maximisation of deregulation and privatisation. But I think the New York Times in 2005 referred to Ireland as the Wild West of finance. Would it have made a difference, really, no matter how skilled the Oireachtas or the opposition was at the time?
Well, the New York Times article, which I always regarded as a bit of a wake-up call because I was finance spokesperson then, basically related to the lack of regulation and oversight, particularly in relation to the IFSC, because as regulation developed in Ireland, and after the Act that Deputy Rabbitte has referred to, I think the McDougall report was 1999. It was discussed in the period up to 2002, and then the legislation began to be brought in after the 2002 general election. But actually, Deputy, the New York Times comment was about the fact that the IFSC and certain types of insurance companies by then were not, as I understand it, regulated at all. So there was a move to regulation generally, but the development of regulation in Ireland was very slow, and the publication of information and questioning of regulators, which is now obviously much more common, it was in its absolute bare infancy at that point in time.
Okay, I understand that. Let me return to 2003 and the bill that Deputy Gilmore introduced into the Dáil, called the Planning and Development Acquisition of Development Land Assessment and Compensation Bill 2003, and it related to concern at the speculation and profiteering, perhaps some would say, that was manifest in the area of building land. Why didn't you introduce legislation since you went into government this time to control the type of abuses that were pointed up by the Labour Party at that stage?
In relation to this specific government, well, at that time, and I should have said this to Deputy Doherty, there was a very strong set of legal opinion, and we were given to understand right up to the Attorneys General. And in fact, you will recall even on the old Dublin County Council, of which you and I were a members deputy, that the advice was that if this approach were followed, that it could result in very significant compensation claims. And if you like, that had a chilling effect on the support for such legislation. So the Labour Party put it forward, but it didn't get any wider spread support. What Fianna Fáil did, well, I think it was led by Fianna Fáil, but they were in coalition governments at the time, was later they introduced the Part 5, where developers would have to make certain contributions in relation to the supply of social housing, or make contributions. But I have to say, Deputy, that never worked particularly well either. So there has been a continuous debate around both the desirability, which I would think is highly desirable in order to prevent the build-up of bubbles, and the legal opinion that such a development would give rise to significant compensation costs.
And
claims.
Tánaiste, you took out from your statement on a separate issue, the property bubble was squeezing the living standards of ordinary people and loading them with unsustainable debt burden, while simultaneously enriching wealthy individuals and companies who availed of a huge range of property-based tax shelters. One of the tax shelters or lessening of tax was introduced by the Fianna Fáil PD government in the 1997 December budget, reducing capital gains tax from 40 to 20%, which was enormously helpful to those who were speculating on building land, and as was seen in the media, making large amounts of money. But in 2007, why did your manifesto say specifically that you would remain with a lower rate rather than going back to 40 or even 60%, which you would look for?
Because, Deputy, I have long held the view, and I'm aware you probably have a contrary view, that the critical issue in relation to taxation is that the real rate of tax that people bear is the important thing, not the nominal rate. You can have a nominal rate of tax, as happened in Ireland in income tax in the 80s, the 60s, 70s and 80s. But in fact, if you have very, very high nominal rates, what happens is wealthy people can afford to employ tax advisors or put much of their activity offshore, and thus end up avoiding almost all of the taxation. I would prefer to have a situation where you have real rates of tax, you have minimum effective rates of tax, which is what I propose, Deputy, and therefore everybody is a contributor, and those contributions are progressive. But I'm not in favour of capital gains tax rates, for example, like you've suggested, of 60%. That has never been my position.
Yeah,
I'm in favour of effective rates.
Tánaiste, we had a witness here, Mr. Derek Quinlan, who put together syndicates of wealthy individuals and, among other things, bought land, kept it for a while, got planning permission, and then sold it on at massive profit. One instance was a €53 million profit for a syndicate. The effect of that capital gains reduction was, in round figures, a tax of 20 million on those individuals to 10 million. Would you not consider it socially beneficial that in relation to building land, particularly a speculation, profiteering, some might say, in relation to that, that you should have stood in 2007 for a much higher rate of tax on gains in speculation?
No, what I was strongly in favour of was an overall approach to the market which would have actually taken the tax incentives. My understanding of the people who ran high net worth businesses, and I don't want to, under the chairman's instructions, to refer to any one particular person, the people who ran those businesses, Deputy, based the appeal for funds on the fact that the investors who invested into those funds would find, through the use of appropriate tax mechanisms, that they would in effect be shielded from almost all taxation, the kind of tax breaks I referred to. So in literally hundreds of Dáil questions and comments, I urged the then government to significantly reduce those, either by capping them, by the use of minimum effective tax rates, and by ending them, because some of them, in my view, were entirely inappropriate. There is a role for tax incentives, but it has to be targeted, it has to be, in my view, temporary, and it has to be costed. And that was my continuous position.
Thank you. Senator Sean Barrett.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome to our visitors this afternoon. As Deputy Rabbitte is one of the most distinguished parliamentarians around here over the years, and should the whole light touch regulation just be kicked away down to the far field, in that we've never brought in legislation, I'm only here one term, that has no penalty. And there's no legislation that says no penalty, more than 5p shall be imposed on this particular legislation. I mean, what we do is regulate and impose penalties, and it's kind of an insult to a parliament to say that it was practicing light touch regulation. And I think that's not what parliaments do.
I still don't know enough about it, Senator. It's a complex issue. We're operating nowadays in a global financial market, and we can't afford not to have regard to that fact. I mean, light touch regulation is or principles-based regulation is one thing, but derelict regulation is a different thing. And it seems to me that we've had derelict regulation. If you borrow from some of the countries whose banks didn't fail, apply their system and enforce it, then it seems to me that in an international capitalist economy, that's probably as good as you're going to get. We're neighbours of the City of London. If we were to take dramatic, radical decisions on our own, what would be the implications, for example, for the IFSC? There's a lot of people employed there, and, it's of value to Ireland and so on. So, I mean, I don't know enough about the question you asked me to give you it's clear that under Governor Honohan, it is clear that he has tightened the situation up immensely. additional people, additional expertise from outside has been brought on board, and it's clear from some of the decisions that he has taken them irrespective of the political temperature of the day or irrespective of who is lobbying him. And, you know, I would like to hope that system can be made work.
Could I ask the Taoiseach in relation to her own profession, don't we need a far sharper approach to accountancy? It mystifies me how much accountants missed. Coming in here saying a bank was solvent in June 2008 and they were all into Brian.
Don't be leading one way or another, but I know the proposition you're putting forward, Senator.
Should accountants be reformed, and particularly based on your knowledge of that profession, Taoiseach?
Well, first of all, I think the fact is that nowadays the accounting profession, legal firms, there tend to be a very small number of very large firms. That obviously has certain advantages, but I think it also has disadvantages in the fact that one firm may be providing a whole range of services, and while firms have Chinese walls, whether in accounting or legal, that they don't share information, I certainly think that more diversity in terms of the functions that are carried out, perhaps by a bigger number of firms, would lead to perhaps more questioning. But standard audits, Deputy, are designed to elicit certain information, whereas our banks faced a liquidity crisis, and of course in the long run, and often in the very short run, a liquidity crisis turns into a solvency crisis. Now, the audits of the banks, and auditors there were internal auditors, but we have heard that internal auditors in certain circumstances did raise questions, but they were contrarian views, very often are treated in that way, so they weren't well regarded. I think the critical issue is that we have a more open society in terms of information, so that legitimate questions can be put. I often found myself in a very contrarian position because I was questioning the orthodox explanation in relation to how the bubble was building up. What surprises me as I look back in the context of preparing for this, that in the history of commerce and banking and so on, bubbles are a constant problem. And I'm just surprised that none of the institutions, as I look back, ever really seem to have queried or questioned the bubble. The explanation then was a liquidity crisis, and no one, as Deputy Rabbitte said earlier, seems to have then said, but if a liquidity crisis is serious enough, it's actually going to bring the whole institution down. And unfortunately, that's what happened. But auditors
the Senator
and
towards
people
his
like
final
that
question, Taoiseach. Senator.
I thank the Taoiseach for her important input on that. Just a final one, thank you, Chairman. If this committee, Deputy, was chosen from 650 people, would it be any better than what you've heard this afternoon? That's a question you raised on page 3, I think.
Yeah, but it's not with regard to a particular committee, Senator. It is my conviction that the network of committees that we have established are too onerous for a small house to bear. I'm not talking about the quality or the membership of a particular committee, but if you have 650 members in a parliament, as does the neighbouring parliament, it tends to develop specialisation. It tends to bring people through as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee who is expert on foreign affairs, who has no expectation of being a minister, or who doesn't want to become a minister, or whatever. In our circumstances, in a very small house, if you strip out 30 ministers and 30 opposition deputies to shadow them, it's a very small house. I mean, our system is impeccably democratic. Nobody can say that there's a point of view in the country that isn't represented here. Some of them are strangers to legislating, but they perform other very important roles. And I think if you have too many committees, or if you have circumstances where, for example, somebody has to rush down to room number 3 to get in 3 or 4 people to vote here, or people have to run off from this committee to another committee because there's a more important issue, they've dual membership of 2 committees. I don't think that can work. I mean, deputies, virtually all deputies. There was 1 or 2 deputies behind me earlier on that this doesn't apply to, but pretty much all deputies have an extraordinary constituency workload, and they have to do that as well. And I think we need to be careful in a small house that we don't grow too many committees.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Deputy John Paul Phelan.
Thanks, Chairman.
Chairman, good afternoon. Firstly, Deputy Rabbitte, in relation to your opening statement on page 2, you said, and I quote, that on the basis of evidence heard to date by this inquiry, it appears that a small number of influential individuals in the financial sector had more influence with government than did Dáil Éireann. Briefly, can you point to what evidence you're referring to, and indeed to the individuals or the types of individuals?
Well, I'm referring, if my memory serves, in particular to the evidence we heard from Mr. Cardiff, when he named certain individuals that he believed were or might have been in contact to press a particular point of view. You know, and it's a matter for the inquiry to establish whether that was purely a patriotic compulsion based on the fact that the people concerned have specialist knowledge that perhaps the rest of us wouldn't have, or otherwise. That's a matter for the committee. I mean, personally, I would like to know who are the owners of the subordinated debt. I think that might be of some interest, that if we knew that. But that was the reference.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to the Taoiseach now. I only have about 4 minutes remaining. Taoiseach, in your witness statement under the heading of policy failures that propagated the crisis, you're referring to the period following the adoption of the euro and up to mid-2007, and you stated that a more proactive regulator would have responded to these developments by taking action to slow growth in credit and to prevent banks from lending beyond safe limits. Did you, in your time as Labour finance spokesperson, request that any specific actions be taken along those lines?
Well, I certainly was mindful of what had happened in countries like Canada and Spain, and indeed in Sweden and Finland. Sweden and Finland had both had bank collapses, but they responded in a different way to our blanket guarantee. It still cost them a lot of money and it caused a lot of pain, but it was a lot cheaper than the blanket bank guarantee in Ireland. Essentially, they took out the bad banks, and they then sought to shore up the other banks so as to keep the domestic banking situation functioning. So, you know, in terms
I'm talking about actions by the regulator before the guarantee. Can you point
to...
The
particular actions I raised in terms of amendments to the bill and subsequently was, and I raised this, by the way, with the Central Bank as well, I'm so concerned about it. In my own constituency, Deputy, there were people going door to door to local authority estates, and they were landing outside a local authority house and saying to the householder, well, I reckon this house is now worth 150,000. Do you have a mortgage on it? Are you buying it? What's the mortgage? It's 50,000. Well, we're willing, because of the equity in your property, maybe to give you a loan of 120,000. And that person often had the loan with the local authority structure. And in fact, I ended up in a number of situations where
You brought those concerns to the central bank?
I brought them to the central bank.
Was any action?
And I think I was probably the first person in the Dáil to mention subprime lending and what was happening in the States.
Was there any action forthcoming, though?
Not that I'm aware of, because it was not deemed to be a problem, but it was a problem because people took out big loans and you were told you can buy a car, you could do up your kitchen, and you expand. And I think most deputies here with large local authority areas in their constituencies would have been familiar. And I have to say I was terrified for people who came to me, and on many occasions I asked people to think about it. I asked them to get advice because I was so concerned. But the response from to be honest, was very cold.
Well, did you follow it up? I mean, the fact that you weren't getting a response,
I spoke
at
various times about the dangers to Ireland of subprime lending, but I was particularly concerned about the human cost, that people were being offered what seemed like a fabulous deal in which they could do some things, but in fact they were going to get themselves now, having almost bought out their local authority house, into a very big debt that was going to last for a long time. I know I wasn't the only deputy subsequently who raised this. As I say, I 3,500 local authority houses in my constituency.
That's fair enough. I want to turn to the guarantee before I finish. Several commentators, and I want to reference in particular a column by Vincent Brown in the Irish Times on 24th of October 2012, have stated that the Labour Party opposed the bank guarantee because it gave too much power to the Minister for Finance. That was what he mentioned in that particular column, and because it did not include a cap on bankers' pay. What do you say to that view expressed by him and indeed some others?
Well, I can say that the Labour Party sought to, as I think probably all of the different parties did, as the shock of the bank guarantee settled on that awful morning, to do the right thing as far as was possible by the country, by the people, by the state. And having been a consistent critic of various elements of finance in Ireland and of the banks in Ireland, it was my honest judgment, as it was the leader of the Labour Party then, Deputy Eamon Gilmore, that this bank guarantee was wrong. And in particular, I was aware of what had previously happened in Sweden, where Mr. Nyborg, who subsequently I think came and visited committees in this House and said how the Swedes had approached it. And it was never going to be possible to exit the problems cost-free, but we could have done it in a more effective way, and we might have been in a position to have rescued the two big mainstream banks, AIB, High Street banks, AIB and Bank of Ireland, in a less costly way. Now, mind you, we will now recover most of what we lent to them through...
Final brief supplementary. In a brief supplementary. I've gone through the record of the Dáil from the debates that took place around the legislation surrounding the guarantee. And you've referred earlier on to burning bondholders and insolvency issues. I haven't, it was me trying to, after the first question that was asked, I think by Deputy McGrath, been able to find any reference of you commenting on that during those debates. But I have one particular quote that I just want to put to you. In the context of the Minister's failure to meet in any way the legitimate requirements of the opposition to protect the taxpayer, I think you were referencing the fact that he hadn't taken amendments on board. We are supporting him in bailing out some banks in order to protect the Irish financial system. Now, that you have referenced in your previous response that some banks had to be bailed out, but earlier you did infer, I think, in some of your evidence that you had concerns when the guarantee issue arose about insolvency. Yes, about insolvency of certain institutions and the burning of bondholders, and yet when this debate was taking place you didn't actually raise those concerns at all.
Well, first of all, I was extremely concerned, and I expressed those concerns in the private briefing with the Department of Finance in relation to the two institutions, Anglo and Irish Nationwide, but a comment was offered that they had a particular model which I didn't appear to understand. I have to say that was a fairly seminal moment because my understanding of the position of those two banks was that they were in fact a serious contagion in the financial system in Ireland. I was very anxious to see the main street banks in Ireland, particularly AIB and Bank of Ireland, actually salvaged as far as possible because they're just essential to doing business. And the Labour Party didn't in any way approach other than with a sense of deep tragedy and upset and concern what had happened, because my fear was around what was going to happen to ordinary people in the fallout.
Deputy Kieran O'Donnell, and then I'll bring in the leads to the wrap-up.
Deputy Rabbitte, in page 3 of your statement, you conclude that by saying, in the narrow area of effective scrutiny of the banking sector, if the structures had existed and if the opposition had known the pertinent questions to ask, the government wouldn't have been able to answer them because the government didn't know there was a crisis until it was too late. To what extent do you believe, you might just elaborate on that, and then to what extent do you believe the new structures implemented since 2010 have corrected the deficiencies which existed, and what further measures do you believe need to be taken? And you might do that in the round that you're departing an illustrious career as a member of the Dáil for many years, standing in ministerial, going up to pastures. I'm putting that, Chairman. Okay, thank you.
Well, I think the decision by the former Finance Minister, the late Brian Linehan, to put in somebody of Patrick Honohan's acknowledged international standing in terms of regulation, I think was a major decision. It broke this automatic entitlement that was there for Secretaries General of the Department of Finance to pass on to automatically, it seems to me, automatically becoming governors of the central bank. I think that didn't help in terms of the incestuousness and so on. I think the structural changes that he has made are far more effective than was the situation at the time of the crash. I think the changes that have taken place in this House, for example, if you look at how the, as you know, as a member of the committee, I'm struck even by coming back now to see how the present-day Finance Committee structures its business and discharges its role as compared to what was there in the past. And of course it's not long ago since there was not a Finance Committee in place at all. I think in terms of the report referred to earlier that I prepared for the Public Accounts Committee, there may be an argument for further structural reform within the Finance Committee to put in place a specific budget committee, provided it were properly resourced. It would have to be resourced because you can only ask members of the House to do so much. The variety of pressures that come on them and responses that they must make to their constituency is such that there is only so much and the expertise needs to be there. So I think we've all learned, I hope, a great deal from this crash, and one suspects that academia will be still writing books about it in 25 years' time. So hopefully the fact that we all, I shouldn't say all, but if there are people who, unlike myself, knew that the financial system was at risk, we didn't hear from them at the time. They kept it a well-guarded secret.
Do you think people knew? Do you think people knew that the banks were insolvent within the system?
I think there is a distinction probably to be drawn between what are now called the pillar banks and Anglo-Irish.
Right, the monoline banks, do you believe people within institutions, within government, were aware and nicely guaranteed that Anglo was insolvent?
Certain opinion, I suppose.
Or do you think they should they have been aware?
My opinion is that their opinion was that it was indeed insolvent. That's my belief, and they couldn't have believed otherwise, given what had happened over the previous months, not just the St. Patrick's Day massacre, but generally what was the word on the street. And I've always thought, may I just say this, Deputy?
Clarify where you're saying where the belief was owned, that people thought that the institution was sovereign. Was that in the central bank, on the boards of the banks, where, in terms of the location of that opinion?
Well, the question was relating to the Department of Finance.
Okay.
And I think that in the case of the Department of Finance, I think they had to have that suspicion or conviction, I don't know which. I mean, I always thought in watching the former Taoiseach, Brian Cowan, before the committee, I always thought that the question that the committee should have asked him, that they didn't ask him, was that if he didn't ask Mr. Fitzpatrick when he was playing golf with them, why didn't he? I mean, it seems to me that the whole purpose of the encounter was to ask Fitzpatrick, what the hell is going on in your institution? I say that without in any way imputing any dishonesty to the former Taoiseach, because I believe he is an honest man, and I believe that, when the crash happened, he did his best by his lights to do right by the country. But I can't for the life of me believe why there was a mediator running between himself and Anglo-Irish Bank, and he was playing golf with Anglo-Irish Bank executives, that he didn't ask them what was going on.
Final question, Deputy.
Taoiseach, do you believe, what specifically would you have done differently in terms of when after 2007, June 2007, in dealing with the banks and in terms of a guarantee, specifically? I don't want the general, I just want specifics. And would it have saved the taxpayer money?
Well, as I said earlier, Northern Rock in autumn of 2007 was a warning shot for Ireland. From the evidence I've heard, I think the Department of Finance, perhaps the politicians in government then, the people in finance, were perhaps aware of it or alerted to a potential very serious risk. Regulation, which would have addressed some of the consumer protection issues, a bigger guarantee on deposits to prevent a run on the banks. That actually did happen. So I recommended that at that time.
So would you have gone for higher than the 100,000?
No, I recommended in September of 2007, I recommended 50,000, and people gasped, believe it or not, because it was considered so radical. I subsequently suggested that it would be 75,000, and in fact former Minister Brian Lenihan, the late Brian Lenihan, ultimately raised it to 100,000, and we supported that very strongly. The second really big thing that was missing that would have been helpful was resolution. In other words, it was almost impossible in the Irish legal structure to in fact have a bankruptcy or an insolvency in a bank. We didn't have the legal mechanisms. That's been subsequently addressed. It's a resolution mechanism that should have been there. I certainly read Professor Honohan's articles around banking crisis as part of the background reading, and that gave a lot of advice. And presumably, subsequently, that was why Deputy Lenihan actually appointed Patrick Honohan as the Governor of the Central Bank. I made my point about the contracts for difference. And can I just say this? The Dublin Stock Exchange, the small stock exchange, bank shares were one of the key elements of that stock exchange, and yet the stock exchange was allowed to become a kind of casino for contracts for difference. The share by investors, the build-up of a stake in Anglo-Irish Bank, which was ultimately potentially going to take over that bank, was key to the collapse of the bank subsequently. Had that 1%, had Brian Cowan implemented what he said he would do, the 1% stamp share tax on the CFDs, I believe again it wouldn't have stopped everything that happened subsequently, but I think it would have been, it might have woken up the investors who were taking over their stake in Anglo through CFDs. If they had to be recorded and paid tax, it might have just made some of the people who were gambling pause for thought. Would it have prevented it? I think it would have mitigated
it. Thank you very much, Tánaiste. I'm moving to wrap up, please. If I can invite Deputy Michael McGrath. Deputy, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just if I can clear up one issue, Deputy Rabbitte, you said that yourself and Deputy Noonan raised a question about solvency of the banks when the guarantee bill was being discussed at the end of September 2008, and you went on to say you wouldn't expect the Minister of the day, Brian Lennon, to come in and say that he believed that the banks were insolvent. I would just ask you to clarify, are you suggesting that the Minister had a belief that the banks were insolvent? If you could clarify that. And secondly, you said a moment ago, and it's related, that the Department of Finance must have had a suspicion about solvency with Anglo-Irish Bank, and I would just put it to you, we've had many of those former officials in who have given testimony under oath, and certainly there hasn't been any suggestion from any senior department official that they had a suspicion when the guarantee decision was being made that the bank was actually insolvent. And as you know, the Governor, financial regulator, gave advice at the time that the bank was solvent. So can you just clarify? I'm just giving you the opportunity to do so in relation to Brian Lennon. Are you making any inference or suggestion that he did actually believe there was a solvency issue with Anglo at that time?
I think, Deputy McGrath, we knew enough about banking to know the difference between liquidity and solvency. And I can't speak for the present Finance Minister, but I know what I was trying to find out was, well, is it true that it's only a liquidity crisis? And quite honestly, I thought it was no more than just a liquidity crisis until immediately around that period when I began to have concerns. Secondly, I think there was a distinction in the areas where this issue was being discussed at the time as between the two old banks and Anglo-Irish. You know, I mean, it was an open secret that people were puzzling with how is it that two banks that were in one guise or another older than the state itself could have got into such a reckless lending splurge. But a distinction was drawn between that and Anglo-Irish. And I must say I had a doubt in my mind about Anglo-Irish. I think that was widely shared. I think the Minister for Finance, I had been opposite him for a year and a month, I think it was, in Justice. And I think you could see the learning curve that he was on. And I think, let me put it this way, he was at least at that stage asking himself the same question. Now, I would not have expected him to get up in the House and make a statement, because that would have obvious repercussions. But I think he had reached the stage, not I think in respect of what are now called the pillar banks, but I think in terms of Anglo-Irish, I think that he had reached the stage. And I say that in addition, I say that from some discussions that I had with him before, during and after. I think he himself was asking himself questions about whether Anglo was in fact rotten.
And are you suggesting that he had come to a view on that question at that time? I think it's important because he's not here to answer for himself. And you're ascribing a possible view that he might have held about the solvency of Anglo at the end of September 08, which
well,
we haven't heard from anybody else.
I don't mean to do that, and I haven't asserted any definitive statement. I'm only guessing. You asked me to guess at the frame of mind of the man when the questions were put to him.
He said he was asking himself the question.
I think he was asking himself the questions, and I think the fact that there was legislation in the department ready to go for the nationalisation of Anglo-Irish, I think, is kind of circumstantial evidence that there were concerns within the department too that was wider than the minister.
Final question, Chair, thank you. And Taoiseach, it relates to the issue of stamp duty and the debate that was raging around stamp duty in 2007. And again, going into that election, all of the main parties competed on how they were going to help first-time buyers deal with the stamp duty issue. And as you know, up until then, there was a threshold of €317,500, and any purchase by a first-time buyer of a home up to that level was exempt, and any purchase above that, stamp duty kicked in, and the Labour Party proposed to extend that exemption up to, I think it was 450,000, so effectively exempting the vast majority of first-time buyers from stamp duty. Like, what was the thinking at that time, given that prices had probably peaked in late 2006 and prices were beginning to fall in the early part of 2007? Had you any concern that creating that incentive might actually push prices back up and put houses further out of reach for first-time buyers?
The purpose behind the Labour Party proposal, and in fact it was joined to Fine Gael, it was a discussion which was held between both of the parties, was that the first time it was to try and tilt the regime in relation to stamp duty in favour of first-time buyers, because the cost of a house, particularly in urban areas, had actually risen from the figures you quoted, somewhere in the 300,000s up to over 450,000, and in more expensive parts of cities like Galway and Cork and Dublin, even far higher than that. So, for instance, two civil servants on something like a HEO's salary, or a nurse, or someone like that, a teacher, two teachers married to each other, were finding themselves priced out of being able to afford a house. So the objective was to try and ensure that people on reasonable incomes could actually take part in home ownership, which I think had been agreed as being a desirable social policy by practically all parties in the House. Now, what happened then was, as well, you had, in relation to second-hand properties, which had been traditionally somewhat cheaper, particularly in less expensive areas, you had competition, which the Bacon reports attempted to address. You had competition from investors who got favourable tax treatment, and again there was a disadvantage to the traditional buyer who was providing a residential home for themselves as they sought to establish a family for themselves and their partner. And there was a step system where once the value went over a certain amount, you jumped up into a much higher rate of stamp duty. And the proposals by the Labour Party and Fine Gael were to try and iron out the anomalies which were arising at that point, which were putting home ownership out of the reach of people who traditionally, I think everybody, all parties, wanted to be involved. Now, Fianna Fáil, of course, subsequently abolished stamp duty for first-time buyers.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So that answered the question.
Taoiseach, you were the Deputy Rabbitte's finance spokesperson from 2002 onwards to 2007, and you had cited the FSR reports in your own opening statement. You itemise about, on page 3, the loading citizens with unsustainable debt.
Sorry?
The loading of citizens with unsustainable debt.
Yeah.
Did you ever go to the then, or whoever was acting central bank governor to ask the governor to take action in relation to the unsustainable debt that was being clearly stated in the FSR reports about household debt in particular?
Yes, I have actually, I think, about 20 pages of quotes from my different contributions and questions at different times.
All there for us, please, Taoiseach.
I can offer you a copy of them, but
Sorry, Chairman,
those who wish to read them can have a copy.
Yeah, Chairman,
sorry.
Did you go to the governor? Not quotes that you put out there. Did you seek a meeting? Did you correspond with the governor, requesting the governor to use the tools that were available to him as the governor of the central bank in relation to the financial stability?
I met with the governor at intervals and I raised my concerns with the governor. But when the Bank of Scotland, Ireland...
The question, Chairman, the question I asked was, if I could, please, did you request the governor to use the tools available to him in relation to the financial stability?
Actions afterwards, but that's a very, very
I
specific
expressed
action.
my concerns to the governor, and when Bank of Scotland, Ireland arrived in Ireland, because this is pertinent to the answer, I expressed, and they're on the public record, reservations about the model that they were bringing in to the Irish financial market, and I also expressed reservations about the development of the 100% mortgage and the apparently cheaper mortgage product that they were bringing in. They were kind of coming in as the Ryanair of financial products, and I have to say it made me deeply uneasy, and I questioned that when Mr Duffy, I think was their chief executive, came in and made a presentation to the Finance Committee.
No, I didn't ask that.
No, just reframe the question again.
Did you ask the then governor of the central bank to use the tools that were available to him in relation to financial stability because of the level of personal indebtedness?
What exact date, Deputy, are you referring to there?
Any stage.
The central bank had powers in the overall macro stability of the country to make particular actions available through their own legislative framework. The central's question is that concerns were known to you, Taoiseach, in sharing those concerns with the central bank, and further to the sharing of those concerns, did you discuss with them that they might invoke this part of the Central Bank Act or this part of the Central Bank Act? Is that fair enough? Okay, thank you.
I had a general conversation in which I raised issues in relation to matters which were developing in the Irish banking structure. I didn't have, if you like, a question and answer dialogue with the Central Bank Act in my hand, because bear in mind, Deputy, as we were constantly reminded and still are, that the Central Bank is independent. So it was a conversation and a discussion in which, on behalf of my own political party, I put forward my concerns, but the central bank governor did not respond as though that governor was accountable to me, because the legal position was that that governor was independent, and I could certainly raise issues with the governor, which I did.
Okay, you conclude, Senator? Thank you very much. Okay, with that said, I'm going to bring matters to a conclusion now. It's 4:30 p.m. I'm proposing to resume in 1 hour because members will need a more substantive break at this time. In doing so, I would like to excuse both Deputy Rabbitte and Taoiseach Joan Burton. In doing so and excusing you, I'd like to thank you for your participation with the inquiry today and for your engagement with it, and to now formally excuse the witnesses. I propose that if we can say maybe 5:25 to get back for a 5:30 start. In that regards, the meeting is now suspended. Is that agreed? Agreed.